So we're going to get started for the remainder of the afternoon here. And I'd like to introduce our next speaker for the day, Rubén, Austria. And Rubén is the founder and executive director of Community Connections for Youth, which is a Bronx-based not-for-profit dedicated to empowering the grassroots faith and neighborhood organizations to develop effective community-driven alternatives to incarceration. And a couple of things of note: he's won numerous awards for his work in dealing with youth, and also he's a member on the National Advisory Board of the Community Justice Network for Youth and the Steering Committee of the New York City Juvenile Justice Coalition. And we're very pleased to have Rubén here today to talk with us about
So good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you today. And I want to speak just briefly, no more than 30 minutes, as Grant is setting up the timer, and I'm sure we will stick to that, on the power of community. And the power of community is something that I want to take a minute to just think about ourselves, right? And all of us, we're here together in this conference. This is great. We're networking. We're building relationships. We're sharing information. But all of us as well will go home tonight, hopefully, and we'll spend time with friends and loved ones, maybe family members, maybe parents, maybe children, spouses. Some of us might go to clubs or to churches or other social engagements where we get together to learn and to grow. And probably for most of us here, if we think about the toughest times in our lives, if we think about when we've been through crises, if we think about when we've had to grow, often we've gotten through those times and experiences with the power of community. We've gotten through those times and experiences through relationships. We've gotten through those experiences with people who have loved us and supported us. And so one of the things that I want to talk about today is to pose the question, if community is so important, and if relationships are so important, and if kind of these natural networks of support are so important, why is it that when it comes to young people in the juvenile justice system, we pay so little attention to the communities that young people come from, right? If young people spend most of their time with their families, then why do we often treat families as the problem and not the solution? If young people wind up being incarcerated and maybe spend 6 months, 12 months, 18 months in placement, then maybe they're spending a fraction of their lifespan in an institutional setting, but the bulk of their time back in community. Even if they come home and they're on aftercare, or if they're on probation, they're still going to be spending probably 22 out of 24 hours a day at home in the community. And yet a lot of our juvenile justice work and a lot of our juvenile justice reform has put the community last instead of first. And so I want to talk a little bit today about what happens when we tap into the power of community. What happens when we put the community first instead of as an afterthought? Albert Einstein said you can't solve a problem using the same level of thinking that created it. And what I want to put out to you today is that a lot of the crisis that we've seen come as a result of the last 2 or 3 decades of using incarceration as the first resort, it's not going to be solved by the same level of thinking. It's going to take a different level of thinking. It's going to take thinking that is actually coming from communities. It's coming from families. It's coming from young people. So what I want to do today is just talk to you briefly a little bit about the situation we're in today. How did we get to a place where we got so far away from the community when it comes to dealing with the challenges of youth crime and delinquency, but also where we are, I think, at this present moment, and what it's going to take for all of us to get to a world where we no longer have to rely on incarceration as the default solution for dealing with young people. And that's why everybody's here today, right? This conference, I've been telling the organizers of it, I'm really blown away because typically at a juvenile justice reform conference, you're likely to maybe find 1 or 2 people who don't actually work for the juvenile justice system. Right? Typically at a juvenile justice reform strategy, you might have your probation department, and you might have your judges, and you might have your prosecutors, and you might have your police, But it often doesn't kind of get out into the educators, and it often doesn't get out into the service providers, and it often doesn't get out into the community organizations. And I think it's significant that folks are here today from all of those different venues, because the thing is, if we're really gonna turn this thing around, if we're really gonna build a world where incarceration isn't such a likely option for our kids, it's gonna take far more than the juvenile justice system to get that done. I've spent a lot of time in my career kind of bashing the juvenile justice system for its failures. Apologies to those of you who work for it, but there's a lot of stuff in the system that's broken. But one of the things you realize as you start to look at the trajectory of young people who go through the system is that a lot of times the failures of the juvenile justice system were preceded by a whole bunch of other failures leading up to the point of that kid being incarcerated, right? And those failures are things that we all share. There's failures that happen on a service provider level. There's failures that happen on a community level, on a family level. It's going to take all of us working together to reverse that cycle. But it's hard to understand where we need to go without looking a little bit back at where we've come from and how we got into this situation. And so I want to back up with you just about 20 years ago in the past when I started doing this work in 1998. We were kind of right in the middle of the era of extremely culture of very harsh punishment for young people, right? We were coming out of the 90s and locking kids up was kind of the first option. There was definitely a culture of harsh punishment, and the relationships between systems and communities were extremely antagonistic. And why were we there in 1998? Well, a lot of it was because we were coming out of a couple of historical eras that led us to a place where incarceration had become the dominant paradigm. First was that in the mid-'80s, the crack cocaine epidemic hit. And a lot of you might remember that, but during the period of time from about 86 to about 1994, the juvenile homicide rate shot up by about 400%. Violent juvenile crime went up. And it seemed like the streets were really out of control. Kids were killing kids. I grew up in New York City during that time frame. I was in high school during that time, and I remember that time being a scary time. I remember it being a time when I just wanted to get out of my neighborhood. I just wanted to get out of New York, and this was happening in a lot of the urban centers around the country where violent juvenile crime really seemed to be out of control. But a very interesting parallel started to happen that you had this big spike in violent juvenile crime from about 86 until 1994. And then right around 1994, the juvenile violent crime rate starts to decrease. But right around the same time that it starts to decrease, there's a whole bunch of literature, there's a whole bunch of research, there's a whole bunch of material that comes out that starts to say that our young people who are getting involved in the juvenile justice system, that they are a different breed of young people, right? There starts to, in 1996, a criminologist by the name of John DiIulio, he writes an article called The Coming of the Juvenile Super Predator. And in this article, he says, based on everything that we've seen and we've witnessed and we've heard from people who are close to the action, here is what we now believe. America is home to thickening ranks of juvenile super predators, and he describes them as brutally remorseless youngsters. He says this includes ever more pre-teenage boys who rape, murder, rob, kill. They have no pangs of conscience. They don't fear punishment. There's no stigma attached to their behavior. And he goes on to say this, at core, the problem is that most inner city children grow up surrounded by adults who are themselves deviant, delinquent, and criminal. Now, if we heard that language today, we would probably say, well, that sounds alarmist. It sounds kind of racist. It sounds sensationalistic. But at the time that John DiIulio wrote these words, he was writing them right on the tail end of about a 400% increase in violent juvenile crime. And even though right at that apex, right around 1994, 95 was when the violent crime started to come down, his words and the resulting panic that these words created resulted in every single state in the nation making their juvenile justice system harsher and more punitive and more like the adult criminal justice system. So pretty much every state in the country passed laws to make it easier to try young people as adults. They passed laws to give young people longer sentences. They passed laws to take away confidentiality protections, and probably most importantly during that time, what you saw happen in the mid-90s was that the funding priorities started to shift or shifted dramatically away from prevention, away from intervention, and went almost exclusively towards punishment. Because if people started to believe that these kids are super predators, a super predator is not going to be able to change, right? A super predator is not going to be able to be rehabilitated. And John DiIulio and others like him at the time said, we believe that sadly the only solution to curbing this youth crime epidemic may be to build more juvenile prisons. And so if you think about a federal agency like the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and you go back to the 1990s, during that time period, even that agency started to shift almost all of its funding priorities away from delinquency prevention and into juvenile justice, right? So in the past, you could get money for after-school programs, but that money went away. You could get money for evening recreation, that money started to go away. Money for mentoring, money for after-school jobs, money for all of these different types of supports that people believed at the time, these things will help young people stay out of trouble. The mindset shifted to say these kids that we're seeing today, they're so bad, they're so remorseless, they're so far from being able to be rehabilitated. The only thing we can do to contain them is to build more prisons. And so that's why you see that from about 1990 going up to 2000, by 2000 we got to the point where on any given day we had over 100,000 young people in prison. Right, we got to the point where the number of youth prisons that were constructed just in the 90s outpaced almost every other form of federal spending. It got to the point where if you were a county or a state and you wanted money for youth services and youth crime and prevention, the federal government was telling you, we can't give you money for that, but we can give you money to build or expand your youth prisons. And so we developed for a period of time a culture that was almost entirely dedicated to locking young people up, not believing that they could be redeemed. Interestingly, right around the time that DiIulio wrote this article in 1996 was when the youth violent crime started to come down. It's been going down ever since. If you look over the last 10 years, juvenile crime, especially violent and serious crime, is 30% lower than it was 10 years ago. And this is a trend all over the country, right? That the crime is going down, the level of offending is going down. But if you ask the average person what's going on with kids, they'll tell you it's getting worse, right? They'll tell you the violent crime must be going up, it's getting even worse. One of the interesting things you see during this period of time is that while violent crime is going down, media coverage of violent crime is shooting way up. So homicides between 1994 and 2002, they go down by about 60%, but television news coverage of homicides goes up 500%. Right? So what starts to happen, even as violent crime is going down, especially juvenile violent crime, the average American, the average person watching TV is becoming more afraid of young people, more paranoid, more thinking, what do we have to do to stop these killer kids? And what I want to talk about in terms of the role of the community is that one of the things that was a collateral consequence of this whole period of time of investing in youth incarceration, believing that kids were super predators, is that the responsibility for supervising young people, for holding them accountable, for supporting them, for nurturing them, the average American said, well, we can't handle those kids just need to be the responsibility of the justice system. Right? So for a period of time, we start seeing kids misbehave and say, well, if kids are misbehaving in school, the only solution is to put more police officers in school. Right? If kids are running around the community, we've got to get more probation officers to supervise those kids. If kids are committing these types of crimes, we've got to build more jails in order to be able to account for them. But the thing that we stopped doing is actually investing in the very communities and the people who are closest to them, who could be holding them accountable, who could be supporting them, who could be supervising them and supporting them. And so we get to the place today where if you look at current statistics, it's projected that if we don't change things, 1 in 3 African-American boys born today and 1 in 6 Latino boys born today will be incarcerated in their lifetime. And I don't know if you like those odds or if you don't like those odds, but those odds are way too high for me. 1 in 3 chance or a 1 in 6 chance. That is not like we used to think, well, there's going to be a few kids who maybe go down the wrong path and are going to have to face the consequences for their actions, but that's an epidemic, right? The odds are way too high for us to continue going like this. Here's the good news, right? And the good news is that we've already started to turn the corner. we've already started to turn the corner on the epidemic of youth incarceration. If we take a look at where we've come from, it was in about 1997 that the federal government started to actually keep tabs on exactly who was in placement and who was in custody on any given night. And as you can see, we hit our high right around 1997 with about 125,000 young people in residential placement or incarcerated on any given night. The numbers before, they're a little shaky because people didn't know quite what it was, but experts seem to think that those numbers kind of doubled between 1980 and 2000. But here's what's been happening over the last 20 years, over the last 15 years, the numbers have been coming down. And places like New York have led the way by investing in things like community-based alternatives, by investing in things like alternatives to detention, alternatives to placement, people coming together looking at policies and saying, we don't have to lock everybody up, we can do some different things. But if we take a look at these numbers, the thing that I want to actually put out to you as the challenge, and a challenge to a place that I think we can get to, is if we've been able to cut the number of kids in prison by half, if we've been able to cut it by 50,000 just since 2000, then I think that if we look into the future and we look to 2050, that I think in another 25 years we could get to the place where we have no kids behind bars. And that may sound crazy, but look at the numbers here. If we doubled from 50,000 to 100,000 over 20 years, and then over the next 20 years brought it back down to 50,000, who's to say that in another 10 years we couldn't cut that number in half again? And then cut it in half and cut it in half, and could we get to the place by 2050 where we have no kids behind bars, where we have no kids in cages? Because when we look at some of our maximum security juvenile facilities, that's really what we have, right? We've got kids who are still being put in solitary confinement. We have kids who are wearing shackles and leg irons. We have kids who are wearing jumpsuits. We're putting children in cages. And I think if we want to go 100 years from now, we're going to want to be a society that looks back and says, man, it was madness what we were doing to warehouse our young people, to shackle them, to put them behind bars. I think we could get to the place of no kids in cages by 2050. But in order for us to do that, we're going to have to really do some different things. And I think we've done some amazing things just over the past 20 years by changing policies, by changing laws, by having a lot of system folks coordinate together. When I first started doing this work, it seemed like everybody was passing the buck. And the judge would say, well, you know, I just sentence them when they come before me. And the prosecutor would say, well, I just prosecute them. And the police officers say, well, I just arrest them. And everybody was kind of passing the buck. And what you've seen over the last 20 years is that different juvenile justice systems have kind of gotten together and said, we've got to work together to figure out, you know, how we can put less kids through the system, because this is madness. But if we're going to get down to that level of zero, it's going to take something more than just the system partners coming together. It's actually going to take a return to the communities where young people come from, that every single person in those communities is taking responsibility for how young people are growing up, for how they're being raised, for who's taking care of them. It's going to have to be a community-wide effort. And I want to put this out there to you as a guiding principle of how do you unlock the power of the community? You unlock the power of the community when you start to understand that the very thing that has been defined as the problem is actually the solution. You start to unlock the power of the community when you start to understand that the thing that has been defined as the problem is actually the solution. If you think back to the words that John DiUlio wrote in 1996, he said, at core, the problem is that most inner city children grow up surrounded by adults who are themselves deviant, delinquent, and criminal. And so in that one statement, he kind of said, you know, in inner city kind of code words for black and brown kids, but said the kids are criminal, their families are criminal, and their whole neighborhoods are criminal. And that's been the perspective of a lot of people, right? Well, even if they're not blaming the kids, well, look where the kids come from. Look what kind of families they come from. Look what kind of communities they come from. There's nothing there. There's no resources. And what I would submit to you today is that the way that we turn this whole thing around is to understand, again, that very thing that has been defined as the problem is actually the solution. What do I mean by that? I mean that when we go and we look at the communities that young people come from, when we look at the families as a resource, when we look at the young people themselves, right? If we change our lens and we change our understanding and we realize that there is greatness and power and potential in each one, then we're going to see that the actual answer for the problems that we've been struggling to fix and to redefine are actually right there in the neighborhoods that we need to approach. And this is a different way of seeing, right? But I want to give you just some brief examples of how this is happening. Several years ago, around 2009, in the South Bronx, where I live, where I work, where I've been part of planting a church, we decided we want to come together and take our neighborhood, the Mott Haven area of the South Bronx, which is known as just one of the worst neighborhoods for children. Highest rates of incarceration, highest arrest rates, highest rates of everything, more than half the population living in poverty. And we said, what if we took just 1 square mile and we got together all of the different grassroots, faith and community-based organizations, the organizations that do good work with young people and engage them, what if we got them together, and then what if we approached our partners in the juvenile justice system and said, hey, when kids are first starting to get arrested, when they're first starting to build up that history of offending, would you be willing to divert them to us instead of putting them through the system? And it took a while, it took a lot of relationship building, it took a lot of planning. But over a 2-year period, we were able to get over 100 young people diverted from system involvement, young people who normally wouldn't get diverted because their cases were considered too serious, some assaults, some robberies, and then some of the little stuff as well. But we were able to get our juvenile justice partners to agree to divert young people to us. And after the end of 2 years and some subsequent research and evaluation, we were able to find that the kids that we diverted, they were a third less likely to get rearrested than their counterparts. But not only were they less likely to get rearrested, they stayed involved with the program. Even though they were only mandated to stay involved for 60 days, they stayed with us for 6 months, a year. As we keep on counting, as the clock keeps ticking, a lot of them are still involved with us. Some of them are working for us. Some of them are in college, others are working in different places, because we said, what if we could intervene early in a young person's track where normally they don't get diverted and get them plugged into a network of community folks who are going to look after them, who are going to see them on the street, who are going to be their neighbors. Small organizations that had budgets of $0 to $10,000, organizations that did stuff often on a volunteer basis, but organizations that were right there in the neighborhood. I would say, when I see this kid getting up and going to school, when I see this kid coming home, if I see that kid not in school, I'm going to go after that kid and make sure they're okay. And so by investing in the grassroots faith and neighborhood organizations just in one neighborhood, we were able to bring the juvenile crime rate down. We were able to equip communities to deal with young people, to the extent that our different community partners started to then develop these collateral relationships with other system partners to go into schools and run programming in schools, to go into the detention center and run programs there to help kids with community service. That's how we invested in local neighborhood organizations. Families. We had young people coming into our program, and we also had other young people that we knew that had been arrested. They'd gone upstate, and we were able to bring on an amazing woman, a parent whose son had gone through the juvenile justice system and was still in it at the time. We met this woman at a conference like this one, and she said she came wearing sunglasses and a hat because she was ashamed to be the parent of a young person in the justice system. She was ashamed of what that would mean for her as a parent and how people would judge her. But she came and she learned and she started to get involved with us. It turns out that this woman was an amazing parent organizer, parent advocate, and as she began to work with us, we were able to bring her on full-time. And in doing a study with parents about what their experiences were with the justice system, we were able to put together this amazing team of parents who then went in and we had a few meetings with some system folks that were very, very interesting meetings. And I gotta just tell you a little bit about these meetings, because our parents had come up with this report. You could find it online. It's called the Families Unlocking Futures, Solutions to the Crisis in Juvenile Justice. But it was basically parents surveying other parents and finding out what's your experience, and finding out that so many parents said, man, they treat me like I'm a bad person. They treat me like I'm the problem. I want to help, but I feel locked out of the system. And so we brought a group of these parents to meet with our probation commissioner. And you know what happened during the first meeting? They just yelled at him for the whole first meeting. And they yelled at him from everything ranging to not just the probation stuff, but what the police were doing, the state of the schools, the dog poop that wasn't cleaned up, and he was just a good guy, and he kind of took it, and in the second meeting they yelled at him some more, and then probably about halfway through the second meeting the kind of angry energy just had enough chance to vent out, and we started to talk about solutions. And in the third meeting, he invited some of his top policy people and planners to come. He said, I want some of our people to come and present to you what we're cooking up in terms of family engagement solutions. And so his people came in and they said, well, we've got some really exciting plans. We're training our probation officers to run a parenting class called Common Sense Parenting. You saw our families' faces kind of look a certain way, and they said, we're also got something else. We're going to give you functional family therapy. And their faces kind of screwed up again, and they gave some very blunt and honest feedback. And they say, you know, when you say you're going to give us common sense parenting, you know, you're telling us we don't have any common sense. That's insulting. When you say you want to give us functional family therapy, you're labeling us as dysfunctional families. That's insulting. And the folks who were coming from a good place and they wanted to help, they said, well, then what do you want? They said the number one thing that we want is that we want to be able to talk to another parent who's been through this, who could help us navigate the system. We want somebody that we could call on for help with our kids, and then when we tell them what's really going on, it's not going to get used against us later in court to say that we're unfit parents. And so the probation commissioner said, so should probation hire parent advocates? And our parents said, no, because if they work for you, we won't trust them. I said, well, what do we do? He said, well, what if we contracted it out to community-based organizations to hire these parents? And they said, yeah, that would work. And so New York City, to their credit, invested in all 5 boroughs for a parent support program that hires parents who have had their kids go through the system to be peer coaches for other family members. And so we've got a team in the Bronx, and there's one in each borough. And what's so interesting about these teams, man, is that they work out of an office in the family court. And I was worried when we first sent them in there, you know, just because we haven't always had the best relationships, and sometimes systems can have a culture that's a little bit different from that community culture. And I was worried, what if our parents kind of get infected with some of that punitive culture? But the reverse happened, and I think our parents started to infect the courthouse with some of that positive family-based culture. And one of our parent coaches, she even told me, she said there was this one PO who was just always speaking to the kids real harshly, and she just went up to him one day and she said, what's the matter? Like, were you bullied as a child? And he said, yeah, actually I was. And so, you know, they got to talking, and he said, maybe you get some better results if you speak a little more gently. And so investing in families, right? Another thing that's amazing, again, when you start to flip that lens and say, who are we defining as the problem and who are we defining as the solution? You know, during that time period in the 80s and the 90s, and some people remember this, so many, particularly men in the community, went away, right? They went away on, a lot of it was drug charges, right? But long prison sentences. And the mindset was, well, if we clear people up and kind of take away this criminal element from the community, then that's going to lead to community safety. And what we've seen is that often it actually did the opposite. That even if there were men and women in the community who were doing some things wrong, that if you took away a whole generation of fathers and uncles and older brothers, then you kind of left a whole bunch of people to grow up devoid of that type of influence. And I know that during those years, I met so many mothers, I met so many grandmothers who were on their knees praying, you know, God, help somebody to help my son or my grandson. You know, his father's in jail, his mother is strung out, who's going to help him? And one of the most amazing things that I've been seeing over the last several years is that just in the last 5 to 10 years, there are so many men and women coming home from prison who made up their mind while they were doing their time. They said, I'm looking at what's going on in the neighborhood that I come from. I'm looking at what's going on in the neighborhood that I once was a part of destroying. And I'm seeing that somebody's got to help guide these kids. These kids are growing up without support. They're not listening to anybody. Nobody can get through to them. I've got to help them out. And so in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen a whole bunch of men and women come home from prison. We call them credible messengers. Men and women that they couldn't get into a traditional mentoring program because they have a felony. They couldn't get hired by a school or a social service department because they've got drug charges and they've got violent crimes on their record. But they are men and women who have been transformed during the course of their incarceration, and they're coming out and saying, I'm going to go where nobody else can go. One thing that New York City Department of Probation did, again, blew my mind. About 3 or 4 years ago, invested $10 million into funding 19 programs all around the city, that each program would hire 5 formerly incarcerated men and women to be mentors for kids who are currently on probation. Do you know what results that program got? It cut the felony rearrest rate in half. So kids who were in that program mentored by somebody who was involved, who had a criminal record, 50% less likely to commit a felony rearrest. And so here's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about we've got to take the very thing that has been defined as the problem and say, no, that very thing that was looked at as weak and foolish and despised and rejected, that very thing is actually the solution that's going to lead us out of this crisis. It's a different posture. It's a different attitude. For many years, the system's been based on a position of power over communities, and that's the punitive model. We're shifting a bit, we're getting more attuned to things like trauma and needs services, but we can't get stuck in a paternalistic model that says, oh, these poor kids and families and communities and neighborhoods, we've got to help them. We've got to realize that the power is actually already there in the community. It just needs to be resourced. It needs to be mobilized. It needs to be listened to. And so it's very easy for me to end my words here today by saying that we're ending this conference exactly on the right note. Because we're turning this conference over at the end to young people who are currently going through this, and we're listening to them. And we're saying, what is it that you need? What is it that you bring? What are the ideas that you could give us that will turn this whole thing around? Because the young people have the ideas, they have the solution. Just a word again on, well, how about all this stuff? How do we pay for it? How do we do it? Somebody said in that strategic plan this morning, there was 90 young people who went into placement just from the capital region. And I don't know if you're aware of the numbers right now, but New York is the most expensive state in the nation to incarcerate a young person. It costs us about $350,000 to lock up just one young person for 1 year. And we think about it and we think about, well, what if we multiplied $350,000 by 90 young people who went into placement? That's $32 million, folks. Right. And so could you imagine if everybody put their heads together and said, what could we do with $32 million to help our young people stay out of prison? Right? We could employ these young people. We could provide employment and training for their parents. We could give them money to start small businesses. We could do so much, right, if we were to shift from that culture of punishment and that super expensive thing of actually investing in our young people and their leadership. So I'm over my time. I could tell you more about youth leadership. I could tell you about the young people that we're hiring. I could tell you about all the amazing things that young people can do when you invest in them as assets. But I'd rather show than tell, and so we're going to turn it over to our final panel of the day, which is our young people, who really, I believe, are the ones who are going to lead us out of this madness and get us to the point. If we can we believe it that by 2050 we could have no kids in cages? You believe it? Say amen. Say yes.